I needed to conceptualize a new concept to capture the phenomena I mentioned so far. So when I look at the relevant literature such as the community psychology literatures, I found a very similar concept, that is a sense of community. This is a psychological state and can be among the residents in a social community. So I applied the key attributes of this concept to my to conceptualize an organization plan for community in my dissertation research. And then, as an HR researcher, I tried to think about which kind of HR practices can support and can be effective to make climate community among organization members. And based on the prediction of the realistic group conflict theory, I proposed the extensive use of the organization-based incentives and employee environment can be two of the practices which can be very useful to make a climate community among organization members. I will a little bit more explain about the realistic group conflict theories later soon. And then, if a community climate is really important, we need to understand what kind of outcomes we can actually expect from the extensive use of the two HR practices and then on organizational climate for community. So in this sense, I extended the aforementioned the linkages between the two HR practices and community climate to the organizational outcomes. Yes.
Andrea, why is that employee involvement is not related with organizational-based incentives? So do you expect to have a relationship between incentives and employee involvement?
Yeah.
It seems like they're independent the way you...
Yeah, two independent variables.
But I would expect that organization-based incentives would influence employee involvement, no?
Oh, why do you think so?
Because if you give good incentives, people will be more involved, basically. If you give them good salaries, if you give them good if you take care of them, so to speak, so they'll be more involved in the company or in the cause that you're in what you do.
That's very good perspective, I think. Yes, it sounds like the organization-based incentives can motivate employees to be more involved in the decision makings. But the HR practices is usually try to talking about the management intention, whether they actually use these HR practices. And then in my dissertations, these managerial intentions in using certain kind of HR practices can affect individuals, psychological state or behavioral outcomes and finally financial outcomes. So I think your idea is very relevant, but in most cases, from my literature review and
from empirical studies, so there is no relationship between incentives and employee involvement. Is that?
Yeah, that makes sense, but I never seen.
You never saw any.
But that's very worthwhile to test whether the organization-based incentives can affect the employee. I think the organization-based incentives can increase employees' intention or employees' willingness to, be more involved in decision making. But this willingness can be realized depending on whether the companies actually allow employees to be involved in decision making or not. If companies don't have that kind of HR practices, like I said before, employees cannot realize their motivation.
Then there is, by definition, there is no climate for a community if they are not involved. How would you see the relationship between being involved in a decision and organizational climate for a community? So your perspective is that if people are involved, there is a higher organizational...
So that means it's kind of from the top. So companies need to decide whether we use, the employee environment. So the employee environment is the practice allowing employees to have more chance of getting some information from the organization, top management teams about the company's success or any other company business-related information. And also sometimes they needed to be involved in decision makings regarding their job, their teams, and their department issues and their organization issues. So, yeah, once companies provide that kind of opportunities, then employees can actually do and can be exposed to the employee environment. So
This is not about the willingness or the
yeah,
motivation of employees
this
to do
is
that,
not
but
from
whether
the employees. This is
it
from
exists,
the management.
whether the management wants that or not.
Yeah, this kind of
But
managerial.
by definition, if the management doesn't
Yeah.
want, so there is no variation in one part of the data, right? I mean,
There might be a level of involvement, of course. In
but
different
if
decisions, there might be involvement.
sure, but if there is a strict sort of 0-1 and there is no variation in 1 second. Yeah.
So, yeah. So in my research, actually, the employee environment was responded by employees. But the questions is like, how much your company's, your organization allow you to be involved in decision making or something like that. So it is trying to measure the managerial effort and management, the concerns and activities and the level
That's
of
employee involvement, right?
Yeah,
Right.
employee environment.
Okay.
So can we say leadership is included in organization-based incentives or not?
Leadership
Yes, leadership
is
in the
not
company.
included in the
Because I thought the the incentives provided by the management can be influenced by the leadership, of course. If the leader supports collective environment, then the
Yeah, yeah.
employees
So
try.
there is before this model. So the adoption of certain HR practices depends on the leadership styles and leaders' decisions and leaders' intentions. So if leaders are really interested in making, the concepts you mentioned, then companies need to have more, organization-based incentives. That is key things in my research. I didn't look at the leadership, but that makes sense. And leadership is also related to, we can predict which kind of companies and which kind of leaders have this kind of HR practices. That is very interesting and important perspective. Okay, so as on organizational outcomes, I consider the voluntary turnover and financial performance because when I look at the literature, these two organizational outcomes can be theoretically related to the two HR practices and the community climate as I suggested in my dissertation research, and also the voluntary turnover and financial performance are two of the major interests in most of the managers in the organizations, in my understanding. So, I think I try to find interesting evidence and practically important evidence to support the practitioner's concerns. Okay, so here is my entire research model. And then when I said before I didn't find any relevant concepts in the organizational literature, so I tried to find some relevant literatures in other disciplines, and then I found that the community psychology literatures, and luckily I saw a sense of community, and researchers tried to identify some key attributes of these concepts. So for example, earlier Rosfeld identified territorial and relational cohesion, and later Macmillan and Chavez, they more elaborated these concepts by identifying membership, influence, and reinforcement. So as a territorial cohesion and as a membership, I think the organization itself can be considered as a kind of organizational boundary which can distinguish internal organizational members and external organizational members. And after that, I think organizational climate for community needs to be conceptualized regarding the influence and reinforcement. That means organizational members should have their common goals, and to achieve these common goals, they need to reinforce each other and they need to influence each other because usually individual jobs to achieve the organization level goals, individual jobs are interdependent. Okay, so in my research, organizational climate for community means employees shared perceptions about their social relationships and mutual concerns and mutual influence. And after that, in order to find out the relevant HR practices regarding the organizational climate for community, I tried to look at some theoretical perspectives, and then I also look at the realistic conflict theory. This theory is very straightforward. this theory predicts that competition between groups for